Stay tuned. Ahead, I'll talk with Eric Weiner about Ben and me, in search of a founder's formula for a long and useful life. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Eric Weiner is a New York Times bestselling author whose previous books include The Geography of Bliss, The Geography of Genius, Man Seeks God, and The Socrates Express. Among his many credits, he's a former international correspondent for NPR, and his writing has appeared in many national publications. He joins us to talk about Ben and me. Eric, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here with you.
In the beginning of the book, the introduction, you talk about reaching a point in your life when you begin to question, what have I done? What have I accomplished? Tell us a bit about that and how that led to the writing of this book.
Well, I reached what I guess you would call an inflection point in my life, which I think sounds better than midlife crisis, where I was beginning to question my usefulness in the world and what I've accomplished. I was an international correspondent for NPR for many years and written several books, as you know, but compared to trauma surgeons, people like that, I was beginning to question it. And a big birthday was coming up, one that featured the number 6 prominently. You can use your imagination. And I was looking for a guide to, I hate to say aging, but I'll say it, aging well, living well. And up until that point, I really had looked overseas. I was a fan of Gandhi and Confucius and other wise people who spoke with an accent. And I had ignored American history, ignored the wisdom that can be found in these shores. And I felt like that was a gap that I needed to fill. And then I stumbled on Ben Franklin.
So Ben Franklin, as you write about in the book, sort of becomes this role model, especially for how much he accomplished later in his life. And I'm assuming a lot of people know about Ben Franklin, but he had so many hats that he wore. He did so much in his life that's probably more than everyone even realizes. So tell us a bit about the extraordinary life of Ben Franklin.
Yeah, I think one of the surprises for me researching this book was how much more fully formed Franklin was. Like many Americans, I had this kind of one-dimensional, almost cartoonish image of him in my mind. There's Franklin, flying the electrified kite. There he is signing the Declaration of Independence. There he is flirting with the ladies of France. And all those are true, but there was a lot more to him. First of all, he was truly self-made and self-educated. He had only 2 years of formal education before his father pulled him out. So he learned a lot, mainly by reading and by living. And he was a printer by trade. And even later in life, when he was an esteemed diplomat and statesman, he would sometimes sign papers, B. Franklin Printer. That's how he identified. He was deputy postmaster. He owned and published the Pennsylvania Gazette, the best newspaper in the colonies. He published Poor Richard's Almanac, which many people have heard of. He was a meteorologist. He was a memoirist. He was a humorist. I mean, let's not forget that the man was funny, and American humor today still traces itself back to Franklin. One story which may or may not be apocryphal is that when the Second Continental Congress was meeting in 1776 in Philadelphia, and they're casting about for someone to draft the Declaration of Independence, they considered Franklin. He was an accomplished writer and diplomat, but supposedly they nixed the idea because they were afraid he might insert a joke. That's Ben to a T.
And you also point out in the book that he was an inventor, and that has many things to his credit in that regard.
Yes. And more than most people realize, more than I realized, yes, he invented the lightning rod. That is his most famous invention. He also invented a stove known as the Franklin stove or the Pennsylvania stove that was much more efficient. He invented The flexible catheter. He invented a long arm, which allowed him to reach, when he was older, to reach books in the top shelf. He invented an early version of today's copiers. And he invented a musical instrument called the glass harmonica, no H, harmonica, which is fascinating. It's based on this idea, if you've ever hit with a spoon or your fingers glasses with different amounts of water in them, and they will make a different pitched sound. That's the principle behind it, but he took it to a new level. And if you watch the Harry Potter movies, you will hear in the soundtrack Franklin's glass harmonica being played. So the range of items he invented is tremendous.
Now, before we talk about some specifics from the book, let's talk about the book itself. And the joy and frustration of your book for me is it's hard to describe. It's, we've got a bit of history. We learn more about Ben Franklin, but we also get your personal thoughts. We get some travel in there and a lot of invitations to contemplate what his life and how he lived his life relates to ours in relation. So how would you define or how would you describe this book?
It's a memoir, history, biography, self-help book. It's all these things. I think you're right. It is a genre-bending book because you will get the arc of Franklin's life as you would in a more conventional biography. But as is my wont, you will go on the road with me. This is part travelogue. We travel, the reader and I, from Boston to Philadelphia to London to France, all these places where Franklin hung his hat, and we walk literally in his footsteps. And the book is also personal. And there's a reason it's called Ben and Me. I thought of it, Dan, not as me writing about Benjamin Franklin, but me encountering Benjamin Franklin. In a way, having a relationship with Benjamin Franklin, meeting him on his terms, and wrestling with his ideas and his personality, the good parts and the bad parts, because he wasn't perfect. And it's also me wrestling with how I can apply them to my life and how we as a society, a fairly fractured society, might apply his ideas to help heal the nation as well.
You point out in the book, like you just mentioned, that he wasn't perfect, but that actually made him more approachable to you. As you write, he's kind of the guy you could imagine having a beer with as opposed to some of the other founding fathers.
Yeah, they were stiff. I can't imagine, having a six-pack with George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, but I can with Ben. And I can picture Ben Franklin, in a coffee shop in Wichita with his MacBook Air and his noise-canceling headphones on, typing away. He is, as I say in the book, he's the least dead of the founders, the most alive, the most present, and the most relatable, partly because he was more honest, certainly in his autobiography, which he never completed, but he's more honest on the page there than the sort of stiff prose of say, a John Adams or somebody like that.
The book is organized in that you have all these chapters, and each chapter deals with a different aspect of Ben Franklin's personality and how he lived his life. Tell us a bit more about that.
So I did not want it to be just organized year by year. Here is him, years 1727 to 1729. I wanted there to be an animating idea for each chapter. And just a little bit about my process as a writer is I need a model chapter before I can write the rest of the book. And once I have that model chapter, the right tone, the right content, then I wouldn't say the book writes itself. No book does, but then I'm off and running. And often that model chapter is in the middle, rather, not in the beginning or the end. And the model chapter for this book was actually the chapter called Buddha Ben, where I realized that Ben Franklin, probably not purposefully, but had many Buddhist tendencies. And I like that alliteration, that phrase Buddha Ben. And then I looked through my material and realized there's a baby Ben, there is an angry Ben, there's a naked Ben, They're 20-some Bens, and each one is a distinct side of his personality. And it's a way to approach him and his life thematically and not just chronologically.
I'm talking with Eric Weiner about Ben and Me in search of a founder's formula for a long and useful life. And our conversation continues in a moment. If you appreciate this discussion, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you'll know when I post new interviews. And thank you. In the subtitle to your book, and as you point out, he used this term a lot, and as a result, it shows up frequently in this book as well. And that's the term usefulness and living a useful life. And on the surface, that seems like a simple concept, but as you get into it, it's not. So what do you think he meant by a useful life?
Yeah, it is a term that, theoretically, I think today we have mixed feelings about being useful. We'll say we want to be useful, but a friend might say and come up to you and say, Dan, so-and-so, she's just using you. That's bad. But Franklin didn't see it that way. He thought that would be a high compliment, being used. He wanted to find the intersection, Franklin did, of his talents and the needs of the society. You could, I suppose, be happy alone in your house, but you cannot be useful really alone in your house. Usefulness, by definition, implies being useful to other people. And Franklin was always looking for ways to leverage his talents, I would say. And not just to say, well, I've been a printer, that's what my usefulness is, I'm going to stick with that. He was always looking for new ways to be useful. And that sort of dictated how he approached life and other people. If you're going to be useful, you can't really alienate other people because you never know when you might need them in your useful projects. So that usefulness theme animated his entire life, and that's the reason that the attending physician, when Franklin passed away at age 84, put in his notes, and so ends a long and useful life of 84 years and 3 months. Those words are not accidental.
And in creating that useful life, you point out through the book and through Ben Franklin's example that sometimes that means doing some things, sometimes that means not doing things or changing what you do to become a more useful person.
Yeah, he took the Hippocratic approach to politics, which is first do no harm. That was a big thing for him. He also was willing to use a little deceit in his usefulness. I'll give you an example. In Philadelphia in the 1750s, there was no hospital, right? No hospital in the colonies, I believe. And a doctor there named Thomas Bond wanted to start a hospital. He's a good physician, terrible fundraiser. He goes to Ben Franklin, and Ben writes an anonymous piece. He was big on writing anonymously in the Pennsylvania Gazette, saying, hey, a hospital would be a really good idea. See, the anonymity was useful. Then he goes to the Pennsylvania Assembly and says, hey, guys, if I can raise 2,000 pounds, that's the currency of the day, would you guys match it with another 2,000? And the assembly head of the assembly said, sure, thinking there's no way Franklin's going to raise that. But Franklin raised 2,700 pounds. And Isaac Norris, the chair of the assembly, had to cough up the 2,000. And Ben Franklin had just invented the matching grant, which is, of course, still used today and is a very useful way to raise funds.
As we pointed out, there are numerous chapters here with different aspects of Ben Franklin. And we don't have time to talk about all of them. But what would you say are some of the key insights that you hope that readers are going to take from this book they can apply to their lives?
That's a good question. Let's take a look at one, which is from the chapter Angry Ben. Now, Ben Franklin felt anger like he was human, like everyone else. But unlike many of us, he did not express it on a regular basis. He did not just let it out. Now, this is our philosophy today is, you got to let your anger out and confront people you're angry with. Franklin didn't do that. He, for instance, would write what I call placebo letters. He'd write an angry letter to someone who really peeved him, but he would, as a policy, wait 24 hours before mailing it. And 9 times out of 10, after those 24 hours were up, he would not mail it. We still have records of it, but he never mailed it, or he would soften it, the language, before sending it. So that's just one example of a sort of practical Franklin approach to getting along with other people. Another example is a phenomenon now known as the Ben Franklin effect. And this is the sort of odd quirk of human nature, where if you want someone to like you, don't do them a favor. Ask them to do a favor for you. Franklin stumbled across this when he was clerk of the Pennsylvania Assembly. And there was a man who didn't like him and was going to make life miserable for him. And Franklin said, "Oh, so-and-so, I understand you have this rare book. I'd love to borrow it. Could I?" The man said, "Sure." And Franklin borrowed it, returned it with a nice note, and they got along swimmingly. So we don't have time to get into why the Ben Franklin effect holds true, but several studies conducted in the past 50 years have confirmed that, in fact, this is true. So Franklin was a great, he wasn't just a tinkerer with kites and lightning rods. He was a student of human nature, and those are just two examples. If he were to come back today, I think he might be a social entrepreneur, might be the position he finds himself in.
When you were relating that story, it made me think again about the term usefulness, and he provided an opportunity for that other man to be useful,
right?
Which provided some fulfillment for him.
Exactly, and there's also this theory of cognitive dissonance that we can't really hold two competing ideas in our head at the same time. It hurts, right? It's uncomfortable. So if just say you don't like me, okay, but I ask you to do me a favor, borrow one of those books on your bookshelf, and then you're like, I don't like Eric, but I'm doing a favor for him, so maybe I do like him. You resolve it that way. That's one theory for the Ben Franklin effect. But the usefulness theory is a good one as well. But the thing is, Dan, it works. And Ben Franklin's philosophy can be summed up in these words. They're actually from William James, the philosopher and psychologist. Truth is what works. Franklin was not interested in metaphysics. He was not interested in the meaning of life. He was interested in leading a meaningful life. There's a difference.
The way your book is designed, at least to me, how it spoke to me, is that at the end of each chapter, there was time for reflection, to think about how he lived his life, your thoughts about that, and then I can think about, well, how does that apply to my life, and what can I learn from this? And the reason I mentioned that is I was wondering about how you envision people using this book, because to me, you need those pauses in between chapters. I can't imagine someone just like sitting down and reading chapter after chapter after chapter, because that wouldn't leave time for reflection. How do you envision people using this book?
Well, I take that as a compliment, and it did not occur to me until now that, in fact, there is a reflection at the end of each chapter. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think you said it well. The idea is, after each chapter, pause and think about how bookish Ben, meaning his relationship with books, might apply to you, how your relationship with books might change or improve, Masked Ben, where I talk about how he writes under many pseudonyms, wore many masks. You might think about the masks that we wear. Right now I have my author mask on, and that's a little different from my husband mask or my father mask or my grocery shopper mask. We have these different personas. So, yeah, I would say think of. I arranged the book, less like a 3 or 4 course meal and more like the Spanish style tapas meal. Lots of small plates, but they add up to a meal that may be more gratifying than the giant 3 or 4 course meal.
And my final question for you about this is also relating to Ben Franklin as well, because he was constantly trying to improve himself. He admitted himself he didn't always succeed at that. So you're looking at Ben Franklin as a role model now. How do you feel about your journey, about what Ben Franklin is trying to teach you?
Well, as you say, Ben did not succeed at everything. And this is, I think, another takeaway from the book, is he called these mistakes not sins or even mistakes. He called them errata, which is an old printer's term, still used today, for mistakes found in the printed page. And what do you do when there's, say, a typo in a book? The publisher goes back and prints a new edition, better corrected edition, but never perfect. And that was his approach to life and mistakes. And I am trying to adopt that approach to my life. I can be hard on myself often saying, I messed up, that interview didn't go well, whatever it is. But Franklin's saying that, no, you can start over. You can always start over. And this is what I'm working on, this notion that if I mess up, no matter what it is, I can always print a new edition, improved but not perfect. I can always start over.
The book is Ben and Me, In Search of a Founder's Formula for a Long and Useful Life by Eric Weiner. Eric, thank you for talking with me today.
Thank you, Dan. Wishing you a very happy and useful day.
Now, if you'd like to purchase Ben and Me, I've placed a link for you in the description below. And if you'd like to see more videos about books and their authors and a wide variety of topics, be sure to subscribe, like, and click on the bell to be notified about future programs. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.